When suicide is murder. Pamela Shelley's life had taken a dark turn during her time with Ronnie Hendrick in DeWitt County, Texas. For months, she had endured his abuse, her resilience tested with each passing day. But now, the end was in sight. On January 6, 2001, she had made a firm decision. She was leaving, taking her 2 children, Kayla and Dustin, back to Arkansas, where she hoped to rebuild a life free from fear. Her belongings were packed, her kids' things were sorted, and they were only 20 minutes away from stepping out of Ronnie's home forever. The tension in the house that day was palpable. Pamela moved with urgency, her mind set on escape. Her daughter Kayla noticed her mother's determination and whispered, "Mom, are we really leaving this time?" Pamela crouched down, putting a hand on Kayla's cheek. "Yes, sweetheart. It's time. We're going home." As the final minutes ticked down, an argument erupted between Pamela and Ronnie. He had tried to manipulate her into staying, using every tactic he could muster. Pleading, blaming, threatening. His voice was sharp and filled with anger. "You're just going to abandon everything here? Abandon me?" Pamela didn't flinch. "You made this unbearable, Ronnie. I'm leaving for the kids. I'm leaving for me. There's nothing you can say to change that." Ronnie stormed off, slamming a door behind him. Pamela tried to focus on getting out of the house. Her heart raced not with fear, but with determination. This was her moment to reclaim her life. Then, suddenly, a loud gunshot rang through the house. The sound was deafening, freezing everyone in their tracks. Pamela's children screamed, and Ronnie's stepfather rushed toward the bathroom. There, on the floor lay Pamela, blood pooling around her head. Panic ensued. Ronnie's stepfather grabbed the phone and dialed 911, his voice trembling as he relayed the situation. "There's been an accident. A woman shot herself. Please send help." The minutes stretched unbearably as they waited for emergency responders to arrive. The children cried hysterically, their young minds unable to comprehend what had just happened. Ronnie, meanwhile, appeared oddly calm, almost rehearsed, as he began explaining to those around him what had supposedly happened. Pamela couldn't handle it, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. She was so depressed. "I told her to stay, to talk to me, but she didn't want to listen. She did this to herself." When the ambulance arrived, Pamela was still alive, though barely. Her labored breaths were faint, and her life hung by a thread. The paramedics quickly loaded her onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. Ronnie insisted on riding along, claiming he could guide them to the nearest hospital. "They're from out of town," he explained to his stepfather. "They'll need my directions." As the ambulance sped away, Ronnie sat in the front, outwardly composed, but his presence raised an unsettling question. Why was he there instead of comforting his devastated children or remaining at the scene? Back at the house, the police arrived to find a scene that had already been sanitized of immediate danger. The family members present all told the same story. Pamela had taken her own life. Their accounts painted a picture of a troubled woman overwhelmed by her circumstances. Ronnie's stepfather echoed this narrative, recounting Pamela's alleged despair and a supposed family history of suicides. "She just couldn't take it anymore," Ronnie's stepfather told the officers, shaking his head solemnly. The police, though experienced, found themselves wrestling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, the story seemed plausible. There was a gunshot wound, an alleged history of mental health struggles, and a family deeply committed to the narrative of suicide. On the other hand, something didn't sit right. Why would a woman minutes away from freedom choose to end her life rather than escape the situation? The officers noted their unease but allowed the official ruling to move forward. By the time the autopsy was performed, the medical examiner had little reason to doubt the suicide claim. The trajectory of the bullet aligned with what one might expect in such cases, and the examiner signed off on the death certificate without hesitation. Meanwhile, Ronnie stayed eerily consistent in his recounting of events. To friends, neighbors, and authorities, he played the role of a grieving boyfriend who had tried his best to help Pamela but couldn't save her from herself. He mentioned her supposed unhappiness and the pressures she faced. She was just so lost, he repeated to anyone who would listen. But whispers of doubt began to circulate, even among those who initially believed the story. Pamela's friends and family in Arkansas were adamant that she hadn't been suicidal. They knew her as a fighter, a loving mother who would do anything for her children. Her sister's tragic death years earlier, though devastating, hadn't pushed Pamela to despair. Instead, it had strengthened her resolve to live. As Pamela's life slipped away in the hospital, her story began to take on new shades of complexity. The authorities, for all their initial conclusions, couldn't ignore the lingering questions. What had really happened in that bathroom? And why did Ronnie, the man at the center of it all, seem so willing to let the matter rest? The answers wouldn't come immediately. Pamela Shelley's death would remain a haunting mystery for years, but for those who loved her, one thing was clear. Pamela hadn't just been a victim of circumstance. Something darker had happened that day. And it wasn't the act of a woman taking her own life. It was the result of something far more sinister. When the emergency personnel arrived at Ronnie Hendrick's home on that fateful day, they acted quickly, but without the usual caution reserved for firearm-related incidents. There was no hesitation, no waiting for law enforcement to clear the scene. Instead, they entered the house and moved toward the bathroom where Pamela Shelley lay, unconscious, but still alive. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse weak, and a single gunshot wound marked the side of her head. One of the paramedics looked up briefly, noting how quiet the house seemed despite the chaos they'd just stepped into. It was unusual, unsettling even. "They're saying it's a suicide," a colleague whispered. The statement hung in the air, heavy with assumption, and set the tone for what would follow. In the moments that followed, Pamela was loaded onto the stretcher and into the ambulance. As they worked, Ronnie loomed close by, his expression difficult to read. His words, however, were deliberate. "She's been so unhappy," he said softly, loud enough for the paramedics to hear. "Her sister, she did the same thing years ago. I guess it runs in the family." The suggestion of a family history of suicide planted a seed in the minds of those present. For the paramedics, it explained why Pamela might have chosen to end her life. For the police, who arrived minutes later, it was a narrative they couldn't easily dismiss. By the time law enforcement began piecing together the initial details, Ronnie and his family had already woven a story that sounded heartbreakingly plausible. Pamela, they said, had been deeply troubled. Ronnie repeated the same lines, his voice cracking at just the right moments. "I tried to help her. I really did. But she just couldn't take it anymore." Ronnie's stepfather, too, chimed in with his own observations. "She was packing up to leave," he explained to one of the officers. "Said she was taking the kids back to Arkansas. But she wasn't thinking straight. She'd been crying all morning, talking about how hard everything was. I guess she felt like there wasn't another way out." One of the officers scribbled notes in his pad, glancing briefly at the bathroom door. Something about the scene tugged at the back of his mind, but the details they were hearing seemed to fit. When Ronnie added, "I was outside when I heard the shot," the officer nodded, writing down Ronnie's claim. Still, not everyone was entirely convinced. "She was about to leave," one of the investigators said quietly to a colleague. "Doesn't that strike you as odd? Why would she take her own life if she was minutes away from getting out of here?" The colleague shrugged, flipping through his notebook. Maybe the stress of it all finally got to her. And with the family history, his voice trailed off, and the question was left hanging. When Pamela was pronounced dead at the hospital, her body was sent for an autopsy. The medical examiner reviewed the case details, the witness statements, and the wound itself. The trajectory of the bullet appeared consistent with self-inflicted gunshot wounds seen in suicides. Combined with the family's narrative of depression and despair, it seemed straightforward. Ronnie's story only reinforced this conclusion. He spoke to the medical examiner briefly, painting a picture of a woman on the edge. She wanted to go back to Arkansas, but I told her she didn't have to leave, he said. She was torn. And her sister killed herself, too. It was always something that haunted her. The examiner's final report ruled Pamela's death a suicide. The case, at least officially, appeared to be closed. But behind the scenes, not everyone was ready to accept the conclusion. Detective Carl Bowen, who had been briefed on the case, couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. 2 polygraph appointments, he muttered under his breath, looking at Ronnie's file. And he no-shows both times. That's not the behavior of someone who's got nothing to hide. Meanwhile, whispers of doubt began to surface among Pamela's friends and family. Those who knew her well found it impossible to reconcile the idea of her taking her own life. Pamela was a fighter, her childhood friend Lisa said later in an interview. She wouldn't have done that. Especially not with her kids there. She wouldn't leave them like that. For now, the story of Pamela Shelley's death was one of despair and tragedy, a woman pushed to the edge by life's challenges. But in the shadows, questions remained, waiting for someone willing to dig deeper, to challenge the assumptions that had shaped the case from the start. In the aftermath of Pamela Shelley's death, as the town of DeWitt County tried to move on, Ronnie Hendrick's behavior began to cast a shadow over the official narrative. On paper, the case had been closed as a suicide, but Ronnie's actions whispered something darker, something that didn't align with the grieving boyfriend he claimed to be. Shortly after Pamela's death, the police approached Ronnie, requesting that he take a polygraph test. It was a standard move, not accusatory, but a step to put any lingering doubts to rest. Ronnie agreed without hesitation. "I've got nothing to hide," he told Detective Carl Bowen, his tone firm, almost convincing. But on the scheduled day of the test, Ronnie was nowhere to be found. Detective Bowen called Ronnie's house. No answer. A follow-up visit revealed nothing but a locked door and an empty driveway. "Maybe he forgot," Bowen muttered, though the gnawing suspicion in his gut told him otherwise. Ronnie resurfaced days later, offering a half-hearted excuse. "Something came up," he said when confronted. "But let's reschedule. I'll be there this time." The second polygraph appointment was set, and again Ronnie vanished. This time, the excuse wasn't even creative. "I got busy," he said, shrugging it off when questioned. His nonchalant attitude frustrated the investigators, who were already grappling with the lack of concrete evidence to push the case further. Detective Bowen's patience wore thin. "You agreed to take the test twice, Ronnie. Now you're dodging it like a guilty man. Care to explain?" Ronnie gave a practiced smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Look, I've been through enough already. You want to believe I did something, go ahead. But I didn't, and I don't need to prove anything to you." The tension between them was palpable, but without the polygraph or new evidence, there was nothing Bowen could do. Weeks turned into months, and Ronnie's trail grew colder. Then, one day, he disappeared altogether. No one in the small Texas town seemed to know where Ronnie had gone. Some speculated he'd returned to his family. Others guessed he'd skipped town to avoid further questioning. "Probably couldn't handle the guilt," a neighbor whispered to another as they watched Ronnie's empty house. For the investigators, his disappearance was a dead end. With Ronnie gone and no new leads, the case went cold. Pamela's death was relegated to the realm of tragic accidents, her story buried under the weight of assumptions and unanswered questions. Years passed, and Ronnie's name faded from local gossip. But for Detective Bowen it lingered. He didn't just walk away from this, Bowen said to Sheriff Jody Zaveski years later. "Men like Ronnie don't change. They escalate." Bowen's words proved prophetic. In 2008, Ronnie reappeared on law enforcement's radar, but not in Texas. He had been arrested in South Dakota for felony DWI, his years of drinking and reckless behavior catching up with him. Not long after, another charge followed: domestic abuse. Ronnie had brutally beaten a woman he'd been living with, a pattern that mirrored the violence Pamela had endured years earlier. When news of Ronnie's arrest reached DeWitt County, It reignited the smoldering embers of Pamela's case. Bowen and Zavesky seized the opportunity. "This guy's a ticking time bomb," Bowen said. "If we don't dig deeper, someone else is going to end up like Pamela." Bowen was particularly disturbed by the accounts from Ronnie's latest victim. Her story painted a chilling picture of a man consumed by anger and control. He'd start fights over nothing, she told officers during her interview. "If I tried to leave, he'd snap. One time he told me, 'You leave me, and you'll regret it.'" The words sent a shiver down Bowen's spine. They echoed too closely to what Pamela's ex-husband had revealed during his own interview years earlier. Ronnie had reportedly told him, "The only way Pamela's going back to Arkansas is in a box." It was enough to make Bowen revisit Pamela's case file once more, scrutinizing every detail with fresh eyes. "He's been running from this for years," Bowen said to Zavesky. "But his behavior doesn't lie. He's violent, controlling, and dangerous. We need to reopen this." Ronnie's trail of abuse and deception was undeniable. Though years had passed, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. His failure to take the polygraph test, his disappearance, and now his violent tendencies. It all pointed to a man with something to hide. Pamela's death was no longer just a tragic loss. It was the beginning of a story that refused to stay buried. And as Ronnie's actions continued to draw attention, it became clear that justice for Pamela Shelley was still waiting to be served. In 2008, a fresh energy swept into the DeWitt County Sheriff's Department in the form of Carl Bowen. A seasoned but determined investigator, Carl carried with him a reputation for leaving no stone unturned. He wasn't the type to let unanswered questions lie dormant, and one case in particular had always bothered him: the death of Pamela Shelley. Carl had been in the area when Pamela's death was ruled a suicide, and he'd followed the case closely. Back then, he'd felt a quiet unease about how quickly it had been labeled a tragedy of mental illness. The details didn't sit right. Ronnie Hendrick's convenient excuses, his failure to take the polygraph test, and then his sudden disappearance, each of these was a red flag. Together, they painted a picture Carl couldn't ignore. One afternoon, sitting in his office, with a cup of lukewarm coffee, Carl opened Pamela's file once more. The crisp edges of old reports and grainy photos stared back at him, and for a moment, he let the weight of it settle. "There's something here," he muttered to himself, flipping through pages. "Something we missed." Carl brought the case to Sheriff Jody Zavesky. Jody was a no-nonsense leader who valued Carl's instincts. As Carl laid out his concerns, Jody leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "So, let me get this straight," Jody began, his voice steady. "You think we called it wrong all those years ago?" Carl nodded. "I don't just think, Sheriff. I know. Ronnie didn't just skip town because he was grieving. He ran because he was hiding something. And with everything we've learned about him since," Carl's voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Jody sighed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "If we reopen this, Carl, we'd better be sure we can find something new. You know as well as I do, this can't just be a gut feeling." "It's more than a gut feeling," Carl pressed. "Pamela was packing to leave, Sheriff. Minutes from freedom. Does that sound like someone about to take her own life? And then there's Ronnie's track record since. He's been in and out of jail for domestic abuse, felony DWI. You name it. This isn't a man who gets better. It's a man who gets worse." Jody tapped a pen against his desk, the rhythmic clicking filling the room as he considered the proposition. Finally, he nodded. "All right, let's do it. But we're starting from scratch. That means combing through every detail, interviewing every witness again, and finding something solid." Carl wasted no time. His first step was to dig deeper into Ronnie's history, starting with his recent arrests. Each file painted a disturbing picture of escalating violence. Victims described a man who was controlling, quick to anger, and dangerous when drunk. One account in particular stood out, a woman who said Ronnie threatened her when she tried to leave him. Carl couldn't shake the similarity to Pamela's situation. He reached out to her, arranging an interview. Sitting across from her in a dimly lit room, he leaned in gently. I know this might be hard to talk about, but anything you can tell me about Ronnie's behavior could help. The woman hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on her sleeve. He's not a good man, she finally said. When I told him I was leaving, he lost it. Said I'd regret it. Said he'd make sure I couldn't go anywhere. Her voice cracked, and she looked away. Carl's stomach churned. It was the same pattern, the same fear Pamela must have felt. Did he ever mention anything about Pamela Shelley? Carl asked carefully. The woman froze for a moment, then nodded slowly. He said something once. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now. He said he'd dealt with women like me before, that he'd made sure they didn't leave. The words sent a chill through Carl. He thanked her for her courage and left, his mind racing. Back at the office, he shared the information with Jody. This is it, Carl said, his voice firm. This is the kind of behavior we're dealing with. Ronnie didn't just lose his temper with Pamela. He made sure she couldn't leave. We need to dig deeper. Jody agreed, and the two men began re-interviewing witnesses from Pamela's life. Pamela's daughter, now older, provided new insight. I remember Ronnie and Mom arguing that day, she said quietly. He was yelling, saying she wasn't taking us anywhere. Then I heard the gunshot. Carl's heart ached as he listened, but it strengthened his resolve. Bit by bit, he and Jody pieced together a case that suggested Pamela's death wasn't what it seemed. Finally, Carl reached out to a cold case television program, hoping their resources could bring fresh evidence to light. When the team arrived, equipped with advanced technology and seasoned investigators, Carl felt the tide turning. Pamela's case wasn't cold anymore, and for the first time in years, it seemed like justice might finally be within reach. In 2008, when news broke that Ronnie Hendrick had been arrested for domestic abuse, Carl Bowen felt a surge of vindication. I knew it, he muttered, the words heavy with years of frustration. Ronnie's arrest wasn't just another blot on a criminal record. It was a window into the truth that had been hiding in plain sight since Pamela Shelley's death. This time, Carl was determined to seize the opportunity. Sitting in his office, Carl dove into Ronnie's arrest file. The details were grim. Another woman, another cycle of violence. Ronnie's latest victim had described him as a controlling, angry man who lashed out when things didn't go his way. He drank all the time, she told officers. When he was drunk, he was dangerous. You couldn't reason with him. And God help you if you tried to leave. The parallels to Pamela's case were chilling. Carl leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he absorbed the information. This isn't just a coincidence, he said aloud, though no one was there to hear him. When Ronnie was extradited back to DeWitt County to face charges, Carl wasted no time arranging an interview. This wasn't just about the recent abuse. This was a chance to finally confront Ronnie about Pamela. The interrogation room was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. Ronnie walked in, his demeanor guarded but cocky, as though he believed he still held the upper hand. He sank into the chair opposite Carl, his arms crossed defensively. Well, Carl began, leaning forward. Been a long time, Ronnie. You've been busy. Ronnie smirked. What can I say? Life happens. Carl ignored the deflection. Let's cut to the chase. You remember Pamela Shelley? Ronnie's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. Of course I remember Pamela. That was a tragedy. She was troubled, you know. Couldn't handle the pressure. Carl's gaze didn't waver. Funny you say that. See, I've been looking into your history, Ronnie. Looks like trouble seems to follow you around. Or maybe you're the one causing it. Ronnie's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Carl continued. You know what else I found? A pattern. Women who wanted to leave you, but couldn't. Women who were scared of what you'd do. Sound familiar? I don't know what you're talking about, Ronnie shot back, though his voice lacked conviction. Carl leaned closer, his voice lowering. You missed your chance to take the polygraph all those years ago. Well, guess what? You're not missing it this time. The polygraph was scheduled, and for the first time, Ronnie had no choice but to follow through. The results were damning. He failed miserably, the machine capturing every spike in his heart rate as he denied involvement in Pamela's death. After the test, the polygraph examiner confronted Ronnie directly. "You're lying, Ronnie. It's written all over you. You want to come clean?" Ronnie shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his bravado slipping. "Fine," he snapped. "I wasn't outside the house when she was shot, okay? I was in the bathroom. But I didn't pull the trigger." It was a bombshell admission. For years, Ronnie had insisted he was outside the house when the gunshot rang out. Now, he'd place himself at the scene, mere feet away from Pamela when she died. Carl didn't let up. "So you lied to us." "Lied for years." "Why, Ronnie? If you didn't pull the trigger, what are you hiding?" Ronnie's face darkened. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he muttered, refusing to say more. But the damage was done. Ronnie's admission, coupled with his failed polygraph, was a breakthrough. Carl felt the pieces falling into place. "He's slipping," Carl told Sheriff Zavesky later. "He's holding on to his lies, but barely. We push a little harder, and he'll crack." The deeper Carl dug into Ronnie's past, the clearer the pattern became. Ronnie's arrests for domestic abuse weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a life defined by violence and control. His relationships were volatile, his drinking a constant trigger for his anger. Neighbors who knew Ronnie from years earlier began to come forward, sharing stories that painted a damning picture. "He was always yelling at Pamela," one recalled, telling her she was worthless, that she'd never leave him. Another neighbor remembered hearing the gunshot that day. "I didn't want to get involved," they admitted, guilt heavy in their voice. "But I always wondered, it didn't sound right. Something about it didn't feel like an accident." The evidence was mounting, and with every new piece, Carl's determination grew. Ronnie Hendrick was no grieving boyfriend. He was a man with a history of violence, a liar who had evaded justice for far too long. Carl knew they were getting closer to the truth. Ronnie might have thought he'd escaped the past, but the past was catching up to him, one revelation at a time. Justice for Pamela Shelley was no longer a distant hope. It was becoming a reality. The Pamela Shelley case, cold and shrouded in doubt for years, finally gained traction in an unexpected way. Carl Bowen, relentless in his pursuit of justice, realized he needed help beyond the resources of his small, overburdened department. He'd heard whispers about a new show called Cold Justice, a program that brought high-profile investigators and advanced technology to unsolved cases. At first, Carl hesitated. Was it worth the risk of airing their failures on national television? Could this really help solve Pamela's case? Sitting at his desk, Carl weighed his options. Sheriff Jody Zavesky entered, coffee in hand. "You look deep in thought," Jody remarked, leaning against the doorway. "I've been looking into that show, Cold Justice," Carl admitted. "They got a solid track record for solving cases like Pamela's. Could be the break we need." Jody raised an eyebrow. "You think they'd even take it? This case is a mess. No evidence tying Ronnie to the trigger, just years of suspicion and lies." Carl nodded. "That's exactly why I think they'll take it. It's challenging, but there's enough here to show something doesn't add up." After several discussions and a formal request, Carl got the answer he hoped for. Cold Justice was interested. A few months later, the production team arrived in DeWitt County, Texas, bringing with them a wave of optimism and energy. Kelly Siegler, a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for being tough as nails, and Yolanda McClary, a meticulous former crime scene investigator, were the driving forces of the show. From the moment they stepped into the sheriff's department, it was clear they meant business. Kelly wasted no time diving into the case files. "All right, Carl," she began, laying out the autopsy reports and crime scene photos across the table. "Let's see what we're dealing with here. Tell me everything you've got, and don't hold back." Carl outlined the inconsistencies, Ronnie's ever-changing story, his failure to take the polygraph until years later, and his suspicious behavior in the aftermath of Pamela's death. Classic abuser profile, Yolanda remarked, reviewing Ronnie's history. These guys always think they can outsmart the system. Kelly nodded in agreement. We've got enough red flags here to fill a football field. Let's start digging. The team worked methodically, leveraging the show's resources to bring fresh eyes to old evidence. High-tech forensic analysis became a cornerstone of the reinvestigation. The gun used in Pamela's death, long sitting dormant in an evidence locker, was sent off for DNA testing using cutting-edge techniques unavailable at the time of the original investigation. While awaiting lab results, Kelly and Yolanda focused on Pamela's personal history. One glaring hole in the original case was the claim that Pamela had been suicidal. Her family vehemently denied this, and the team quickly discovered there was no documented history of mental illness. That's a big deal, Kelly noted during a strategy session. If we can establish that Pamela wasn't suicidal, we're tearing apart the very foundation of Ronnie's story. Witness interviews became another critical piece of the puzzle. The Cold Justice team conducted fresh interviews with neighbors, friends, and family members, some of whom had never been questioned thoroughly before. I always thought something was off, one neighbor confessed. Pamela seemed scared of Ronnie, like she was walking on eggshells. But after the cops said it was a suicide, I figured maybe I was imagining things. Another key interview came from Pamela's daughter, Kayla, who had grown up in the years since her mother's death. Kayla provided chilling insights into the atmosphere of fear and control that dominated their time with Ronnie. He would yell at her for the smallest things, Kayla recalled. She was terrified of him, but she tried to protect us. That's why she wanted to leave. As the team pieced together Pamela's life and the events leading up to her death, a chilling pattern emerged. The narrative of a desperate woman taking her own life began to crumble under the weight of new evidence and testimony. The public quickly became invested in the case. The presence of cold justice in DeWitt County created a buzz that spread beyond the small town. Local news outlets covered the story, and the renewed attention brought more people forward, sharing memories and insights that had previously been overlooked. When the DNA results from the gun finally came back, they didn't deliver the smoking gun, pun intended, that the team had hoped for. But that didn't deter them. Kelly and Yolanda were seasoned enough to know that solving a case rarely hinged on a single piece of evidence. We don't need a magic bullet, Kelly said confidently during a team meeting. We need a mountain of reasonable doubt about Ronnie's story. And we're building that mountain, one piece at a time. Carl watched in awe as the team's expertise and relentless drive breathed new life into a case he'd feared might remain cold forever. Cold justice had given them more than just technical support. It had reignited hope. The combination of advanced forensic testing, new interviews, and a fresh analysis of old evidence left them with a compelling narrative. Pamela Shelley hadn't chosen to die. She'd been silenced by a man who refused to let her leave. As the team prepared to present their findings to the district attorney, Carl couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Bringing in cold justice had been a gamble, but it was paying off in ways he couldn't have imagined. This wasn't just a television show. It was a turning point. For Pamela, for her family, and for justice. The team from Cold Justice had already created a buzz in DeWitt County, but their real work was just beginning. As they delved deeper into the case, critical cracks in Ronnie's version of events began to surface. Each discovery seemed to push the scales further from the notion of suicide and closer to a chilling conclusion. Pamela Shelley's death was no accident, nor was it self-inflicted. One of the first major revelations came from Pamela's medical records. Kelly Siegler and Yolanda McClary had requested the files early on, hoping to confirm or refute the claims that Pamela had been suicidal. The results were as clear as they were shocking. There wasn't a shred of evidence to support Ronnie's assertion that Pamela suffered from depression or any other mental illness. "This is big," Yolanda said, flipping through the documents with a furrowed brow. "She's got a clean bill of mental health. No therapy, no medication, nothing." Kelly leaned over the table, her sharp eyes scanning the records. This completely undermines Ronnie's story. If she wasn't depressed, what's the motive for suicide? It just doesn't add up. While the absence of a mental health history was damning enough, it was the interviews with witnesses that truly began to paint a different picture. Carl Bowen joined Kelly and Yolanda as they tracked down people who had been in Pamela's life, starting with neighbors who lived near Ronnie's house. One elderly neighbor hesitated as the cameras rolled, her nervous glances betraying years of suppressed suspicion. "I remember that day," she said quietly. "Heard the shot. Thought it was fireworks at first, but then I saw all the commotion. Poor girl. Never really seemed happy around him." "Did you notice anything unusual about their relationship?" Yolanda pressed gently. The woman nodded slowly. "He had a temper, you know? Always yelling." She tried to put on a brave face, but you could tell she was scared. It was in her eyes. This testimony mirrored what Pamela's daughter, Kayla, had already shared. Though just a child at the time, Kayla's memories were vivid and heartbreaking. "Mom wanted to leave so bad," Kayla recalled. "She said we were going back to Arkansas, and she promised we'd be safe there. But Ronnie wouldn't let her go. I remember him screaming that she couldn't take us. He said she'd have to leave in a box." That chilling statement was a turning point for the investigation. It wasn't just a heated argument, it was a threat. And it aligned disturbingly well with other pieces of evidence. The Cold Justice team decided it was time to conduct a reenactment of the alleged suicide. Using the original police reports and autopsy details, they recreated the scene in meticulous detail. The bathroom where Pamela had been found was small, cramped, and cluttered. Yolanda stood in the space, analyzing the angles and positions described in the original files. If she shot herself while standing, Yolanda began, holding a mock pistol to her head in the same position indicated in the autopsy, the bullet trajectory would have been slightly different. "Look here," she pointed at the wall behind her. "The angle doesn't quite match." Kelly frowned, pacing the tiny room. "And what about the lack of gunpowder residue on her hands? That's a major red flag. If she pulled the trigger herself, we'd expect to see more evidence of that." Carl, watching from the doorway, added, "The position of her body never sat right with me either." The original investigators chalked it up to her collapsing post-shot, but it feels staged. Piece by piece, the reenactment began to dismantle Ronnie's version of events. The gunshot wound, initially deemed consistent with a suicide, now seemed to tell a different story. A story of control, anger, and a calculated attempt to cover up the truth. Meanwhile, the reanalysis of physical evidence brought additional discrepancies to light. The Cold Justice team had the advantage of modern forensic tools, and they used them to scrutinize every detail. Fibers on Pamela's clothing, fingerprints on the gun, and even the trajectory analysis were revisited. "This wasn't just sloppy work back then," Kelly said, her frustration evident. "It was a complete failure to follow through. But now we're seeing the cracks, and Ronnie's lies are starting to show." One of the most damning pieces of new evidence came from a phone interview with Pamela's ex-husband, Jesse. Though incarcerated, Jesse had critical information to share. He recalled speaking to Pamela on the very day she died. "She told me she was leaving him," Jesse recounted. "She was scared, but she was ready. Said she had the kids' stuff packed and was heading back to Arkansas." Then Ronnie grabbed the phone, yelling that she wasn't going anywhere. "I'll never forget what he said. The only way she's leaving is in a box." Kelly, always the skeptic, arranged for Jesse to take a polygraph test to verify his story. He passed. By now, the case against Ronnie Hendrick was becoming impossible to ignore. His narrative of a suicidal Pamela, once accepted by authorities and the medical examiner, had been systematically dismantled. What emerged in its place was a chilling portrait of a controlling, violent man desperate to maintain power over a woman who dared to defy him. As the Cold Justice team prepared to present their findings to the district attorney, Carl felt a renewed sense of purpose. For years, Pamela's death had been a mystery, her voice silenced. But now, thanks to relentless determination and a fresh look at the evidence, the truth was coming to light. Pamela didn't take her own life, Kelly declared during a team meeting. She fought to escape, and Ronnie made sure she couldn't. This isn't just a case of murder. It's a case of justice long overdue. The breakthrough came in the form of a phone call, a conversation buried in the chaos of January 6, 2001, that would now resurface to shine a stark light on Ronnie Hendrick's true nature. It was a piece of evidence that had been overlooked for years, but when Pamela's ex-husband Jesse was contacted by investigator Carl Bowen, the long-forgotten call came back to life. "I remember that day clear as a bell," Jesse began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. Speaking from a Texas prison, where he was serving time for unrelated charges, Jesse recounted what had happened. "Pam called me in the morning. She was scared, but she was determined. She said she was done with him, ready to come back to Arkansas with the kids. She told me everything was packed, and they were leaving that afternoon." Carl leaned forward, his notepad untouched as he listened intently. "What happened next, Jesse? Did anything seem off?" Jesse paused, his voice lowering as if the memory itself was too heavy to revisit. "While we were talking, I heard him in the background, Ronnie. He must have grabbed the phone because the next thing I know, I'm hearing his voice, loud and clear." "And Carl," Jesse's voice wavered. "I'll never forget what he said." Carl braced himself. "What did he say?" Jesse took a deep breath. "The only way she's going back to Arkansas is in a box." The weight of those words hung in the air like a thundercloud. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise, one that now seemed to have been carried out. Back in the Cold Justice Team's makeshift command center, Carr relayed Jesse's account to Kelly Siegler and Yolanda McClary. The room fell silent as they absorbed the significance of the revelation. "In a box," Kelly repeated slowly, her expression hardening. "That's as clear a motive as you'll ever get. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. This was premeditated." Yolanda nodded, her fingers tapping on a folder filled with crime scene notes. "It aligns with everything we've seen. The control, the violence, the timing of the gunshot right before she was supposed to leave." Ronnie wasn't just angry. He was desperate to keep her from escaping. But the revelation wasn't enough on its own. Jesse's testimony, damning as it was, needed to be corroborated. And for that, the Cold Justice Team insisted on one critical step, a polygraph test. Jesse agreed without hesitation, his resolve clear. "I'm telling the truth," he said firmly. "I've got nothing to hide." The test was conducted under strict protocols, with an experienced examiner asking Jesse about the call, the threat, and his recollection of the events leading up to Pamela's death. When the results came back, they were unequivocal. Jesse was telling the truth. For Carl, this was the confirmation he'd been waiting for. He brought the results to Kelly and Yolanda, who immediately began piecing together how this new information fit into the larger narrative of the case. "Think about it," Kelly said, pacing the room. "Pamela was minutes away from leaving. She was ready to go, but Ronnie knew he'd lose control the moment she walked out that door. That threat wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It was his plan," Yolanda added, "and it makes his behavior after the shooting even more suspicious. Why didn't he stay for the polygraph? Why did he vanish right after the funeral? Because he knew the truth was going to catch up with him." The team decided it was time to confront Ronnie's story head-on. Armed with Jesse's testimony and the polygraph results, they revisited every aspect of the case. From the physical evidence at the crime scene to Ronnie's inconsistent statements, everything pointed to the same conclusion. Pamela's death was not a suicide. It was a calculated act of violence born from control and rage. Meanwhile, Jesse's account was presented to the district attorney as part of the growing mountain of evidence against Ronnie. The DA, who had been hesitant to proceed with the case due to its initial ruling as a suicide, now had something concrete to lean on. "This isn't just hearsay," Carl argued during a meeting with the DA. "Jesse passed the polygraph. His story matches the timeline. And that threat, it's the linchpin. It shows intent. As the team prepared to present their findings in court, they knew that the phone call wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was a window into Ronnie's mindset. It revealed a man who was willing to do whatever it took to maintain control, even if it meant ending Pamela's life. For Carl, Kelly, Yolanda, and everyone involved, Jesse's account was more than just a chilling detail. It was the voice of a truth that had been buried for too long. And as the case moved closer to trial, it became clear that Ronnie's words on that fateful day would come back to haunt him. The case of Pamela Shelley took another dramatic turn as the trial for Ronnie Hendrick drew near. Years of waiting, investigating, and seeking justice had led to this point. The evidence against Ronnie was overwhelming. Jesse's testimony, Ronnie's failed polygraph, and the mountain of inconsistencies in his story painted a clear picture of guilt. But just as the wheels of justice seemed poised to turn, an unexpected obstacle appeared. In the days leading up to the trial, an episode of Cold Justice aired, detailing the investigation into Pamela's death. The program was gripping, filled with reenactments, expert analysis, and the damning details of Ronnie's behavior. It was compelling television, but it carried unintended consequences. Carl Bowen, who had worked tirelessly on the case, remembered the moment he realized the problem. "As soon as I saw the broadcast date, my heart sank," he admitted later. "I knew it was going to complicate things. You can't unring that bell." The episode captivated the local community, with many viewers glued to their screens. But for Carl and the legal team, the timing was disastrous. The trial was scheduled to begin just days later, and the public's exposure to the show meant that many potential jurors had already formed opinions about Ronnie's guilt. When jury selection began, the fallout from the episode became immediately apparent. Juror after juror admitted to watching the episode. Some nodded emphatically when asked if they believed Ronnie was guilty. Others shared strong opinions about the case, citing details from the program. The courtroom was filled with murmurs as one potential juror said, "I saw the episode, and there's no doubt in my mind he did it." Ronnie's defense attorney seized the moment, requesting a mistrial. The argument was simple. Finding an unbiased jury was impossible after such a widespread airing of the case. The judge, bound by legal precedent, had no choice but to agree. The trial was postponed, and a new date was set months down the line. For Pamela's family, the mistrial was a crushing blow. Kayla, Pamela's daughter, expressed her frustration to Carl. "How much longer do we have to wait? He's guilty. We all know it." Carl tried to reassure her. "Kayla, I promise you we're not giving up. This delay might feel like a setback, but it won't stop us from getting justice." As the new trial date approached, the district attorney saw an opportunity. The widespread attention generated by Cold Justice had created a unique pressure on Ronnie. The court of public opinion was heavily against him, and Ronnie's legal team knew it. With so many people convinced of his guilt, selecting an impartial jury would still be a challenge, and any jury that was seated would likely lean toward a conviction. The DA decided to leverage this pressure, calling Ronnie's attorney for a meeting. "Let's be real," the DA began, laying out the situation. "Your client isn't going to walk away from this. Even with a mistrial, the evidence is solid. And thanks to that episode, everyone around here knows what kind of man he is." Ronnie's attorney leaned back, frowning. "You think public perception guarantees a conviction?" The DA didn't hesitate. "I think it makes the jury's decision that much easier. And if this goes to trial again, Ronnie is looking at a life sentence. We're offering him a chance to avoid that." The plea deal was straightforward. Ronnie would plead guilty to murder in exchange for a sentence of 22 years in prison. For Ronnie, it was a bitter pill to swallow, but the alternative was far worse. The evidence, the public sentiment, and the damning testimony were all stacked against him. The next day, Ronnie agreed to the deal. In a tense courtroom, he stood before the judge and formally entered his guilty plea. His voice was barely audible as he said the words, but they carried the weight of years of evasion and lies. Guilty. For Pamela's family, the plea deal brought a bittersweet sense of closure. Kayla and Dustin, now grown, were present in court. As the sentence was handed down, Kayla squeezed her brother's hand. "It's not enough," she whispered. "But at least he's not walking free." Carl Bowen, watching from the back of the room, reflected on the long journey to this moment. It wasn't the perfect outcome, but it was justice nonetheless. "We got him," he murmured. "Finally, we got him." The community, still reeling from the revelations of the cold justice episode, saw the plea deal as a victory for justice. Ronnie Hendrick's name became synonymous with betrayal, control, and violence, a stark reminder of the dark truths that had unfolded in DeWitt County. For Pamela Shelley, whose voice had been silenced too soon, the truth had finally come to light. Though the scars of her loss would never fully heal, those who loved her took solace in knowing that Ronnie would spend the next 2 decades behind bars, paying for the life he took and the family he shattered. After years of twists and turns, false assumptions, and painstaking investigation, justice was finally served. Ronnie Hendrick, once thought to have gotten away with murder, stood in front of the judge and received his sentence. The courtroom was quiet, the air heavy with the weight of the years that had passed since Pamela Shelley's death. Her family, her children, and those who had fought for her life all sat in the same room, waiting for the final decision. Ronnie's guilty plea to murder brought a sense of finality, but it was also a bitter pill to swallow for those who had been waiting for the truth to come out. Pamela's daughter, Kayla, couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. She had been just 12 years old when her mother died, and now, as a young adult, the pain of losing her mother never truly went away. Still, she sat with her brother Dustin, holding onto the belief that at least something had been done to hold the man responsible for her death accountable. "I never thought this day would come," Kayla said softly, looking down at her hands. "But it's not enough. 22 years is nothing compared to what he took from us." Dustin, his voice quiet but firm, nodded. "At least he won't be free to hurt anyone else." Carl Bowen, the investigator who had spent years tirelessly digging through the case, stood in the back of the courtroom, watching as Ronnie was led away in handcuffs. The satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served was tempered by the realization of how much time had been wasted. Time Pamela would never get back. Time that had allowed Ronnie to continue his reign of terror. But Carl had not given up. Despite the initial rush to close the case as a suicide, he had always felt something was wrong. The red flags had been there from the beginning. The way Ronnie had avoided the polygraph tests, his hasty disappearance after the incident, and his troubled past of abuse. It was his relentless pursuit of the truth, combined with the breakthrough provided by the cold justice team, that had brought Ronnie to justice. "We did it," Carl whispered to himself, his eyes scanning the room, filled with the people who had worked alongside him to bring this case to the light of day. It had been a long, painful road, but the truth had finally been uncovered. For Pamela's family, there was no true joy in the outcome. There was no relief that could erase the pain of losing a mother, a daughter, a sister. But there was a sense of closure, a feeling that at least Pamela had not been forgotten. The world knew now that her death was not a suicide, but a senseless act of violence at the hands of someone she had trusted. "I just hope it gives people a reason to keep fighting," Kayla said after the sentencing. "Maybe it'll make others believe that if you don't give up, you can get the truth, no matter how long it takes." The case of Pamela Shelley highlighted a crucial point. Sometimes, the truth takes time to uncover. It took years of investigation, revisiting the case, and using new technology and modern media platforms like Cold Justice to shed light on the darker aspects of the case. The involvement of the program was a game changer, using up-to-date forensic techniques and crime scene reenactments to re-examine everything that had been previously overlooked. It was a reminder of how vital it is to not close a case prematurely, especially when there is doubt or when unanswered questions linger. As Carl Bowen and the Sheriff's Department had shown, there was always more to a story than what appeared on the surface. The investigation into Pamela's death was not just a matter of getting one man behind bars. It was about challenging assumptions, pushing back against what others thought they knew, and revisiting a case with fresh eyes. And the role of media was undeniable. Cold Justice had provided a platform for the case to reach a wider audience, reinvigorating public interest and sparking renewed efforts to uncover the truth. The case was a powerful example of how television programs, when used responsibly, could help bring justice to those whose voices had been silenced. In the end, Ronnie Hendrick's 22-year sentence didn't erase the pain or the years of grief that Pamela's family had endured. But it did offer a small measure of peace, a reminder that even when the path to justice seems long and uncertain, persistence can lead to the truth. For Pamela, and for those who loved her, it was the closest they would come to justice being fully served.